Hello and welcome to this short video, Imported Food Procedures. My name's Andy Bowles and I'm a food lawyer. Now this video is the 91st in a series of 100 short videos on UK food law topics. You may be watching this as part of our online training service at abcfoodlaw.co.uk. If that's the case, there are lots of additional materials you can download for this video. You can watch all the other videos that I've produced within this series of 100, but you'll also have access to over 100 webinars, including about half a dozen on imported food topics, which are about an hour long. And you also have access to some written online training course, which go into far more detail on the topic. So it depends on what sort of level of information you require. If you're watching this on our YouTube channel, well, you're very welcome as well. Okay, so for the purposes of importation of food into Great Britain. Now, Great Britain is England, Wales, and Scotland. Okay, so Great Britain does not include Northern Ireland, which is a slightly separate case, but Northern Ireland is in the United Kingdom. So imports into Great Britain is what I'm going to consider on this video. And for the purposes of importation, food can be placed into one of several categories. And depending on which category the food that's being imported from outside of Great Britain fits into, different rules will apply. The first category is products of animal origin, POAO. Products of animal origin, as the name suggests, would include meat, fish, dairy, eggs, but it also includes things like honey, which is something that's often missed by the food trade. There are also some peripheral products, frogs' legs and tripe and things like that. Anything of animal origin fits into the POAO category. There is a short video on products of animal origin elsewhere. The other category is foods not of animal origin, FNAO. These are, of course, as the name again suggests, not of animal origin, so fruit and veg, herbs and spices, drinks, alcoholic drinks, soft drinks, anything that's not of animal origin. There are some foods not of animal origin that are treated slightly differently from others. These are called high-risk foods not of animal origin. There's a separate video on this topic, as well as on our online, a separate webinar also going into this, because high-risk foods not of animal origin are imported from around the world, but there is either a well-established association with a known problem. For example, peanuts from China are well established with mycotoxin contamination. There is a separate video on mycotoxins, but that's a sort of poison produced by fungi. So there is an association with it. So when importing something like peanuts from China into Great Britain, then there are additional rules that need to be followed. But there is also, with high-risk foods not of animal origin, as well as well-established foods that need to go through additional import checks, it's a sort of dynamic area. There are continually increasing knowledge about various foods around the world. So some foods are put on a temporary list, but there is a separate video on high-risk foods not of animal origin, which explains all that in a bit more detail. The other category of food is composite food. This is where food has got products of animal origin which has been processed and then plant material is added to it. So things like a chicken curry and rice or a pizza would have both the plant, product of animal origin and plant material. These are treated as a sort of lower risk category. There are some composite foods that are subject to exemptions from import checks and some that would go through rather low risk import checks. But again, there is a separate video on composite foods which deals with the issue because it is a little bit more complicated. Okay, so just as an overview, we've got those four types of food depicted by the little pictures behind me, if you can see them. Products of animal origin, food not of animal origin, high risk food not of animal origin, and composites. We have an official control regulation which sets out how these should be imported into Great Britain. So a product of animal origin and a high-risk food not of animal origin should only be imported through designated points of entry. These are called border control posts. The same applies to composite foods unless they're exempt. So a border control post, there is a separate video on what a border control post is, but it's basically a facility at a point of entry that has been authorised for performing checks on the relevant food. Products of animal origin at a border control post will be subject to veterinary checks. Veterinary checks performed by either veterinarians or official fish inspectors at the point of entry. In order to go through that process, you need to notify the port that you're going to be importing these products, and you use the IPAF system to do that. Separate video on that. And the document that goes through the process that's validated by the port is called a Common Health Entry Document, a CHED. Again, there is a separate video on that. So products animal origin, border control posts, veterinary checks, pre-notification and CHED. Yeah, that's what you need to know. If you're importing other foods that are not products of animal origin, they're not high risk foods not of animal origin, then pretty much you have to import them, or you can import them through any port within Great Britain. For high risk foods not of animal origin, remember these peanuts from China, for example, well, they go through a border control post, but they're not subject to veterinary checks, but it's a similar process. It's called enhanced checks. And a common health entry document is also used, as is IPAF, but the common health entry document is a slightly different version. Again, there are separate videos which explain that. So that's just an overview. The border control posts are located around Great Britain, so you can find out where they are from the www.gov.uk website, but they'll be located at seaports or at airports. We have a border target operating model, the BTOM, which has now been, at the time of recording this on the 1st of May 2024, was implemented. The third implementation was yesterday, the 30th of April. So now we are performing almost full checks on imported goods coming into Great Britain from the European Union, for example. There are some just further checks that will be coming in, and a trusted trader scheme that will be being implemented in October 2024. But what the BTOM does, it sets out a risk-based approach to what are known as the sanitary and phytosanitary controls, the SPS system. So when you present your product of animal origin or your food not of animal origin, whatever it is, there is a risk-based approach to how that will be looked at the ports. This graduated implementation is almost complete. In order to pre-notify the port of entry that you're bringing, the border control post, that you're bringing, for example, a product of animal origin in, but it also applies to high-risk foods not of animal origin, also other products that I'm not talking about, a bit outside the scope of this video, but things like live animals, and there are other products that are required to be notified before coming into a port, but they sort of fall a little bit outside of my remit. But in order to do this, you need somebody in Great Britain responsible for the consignment. So that needs to be somebody with an office within Great Britain. What they will do is an online pre-notification of the border control post at least one day before the consignment is due to arrive. And what you'll do on that, you'll explain what it is, where it's come from, identify things like commodity codes. There is a separate video. There's 100 of these videos, so there would be, really, wouldn't there? Separate videos on all of those issues, from commodity codes through to IPAFs. So you can go and have a look at them if you wish. So once the product's animal origin has arrived at the border control post, having been pre-notified using the IPAF system, it will be subject to veterinary checks, where the officers at the port will conduct, depending on the nature of the product and the risk associated with the product, they will undertake documentary, identity and physical checks. And a documentary check is just checking things like health certification and any other documentation that's required as part of the importation process. Identity check is really just making sure that the food that's arrived at the port is actually the same food that was referred to in the documents. That could be just checking seal numbers on containers or other means. And the physical check is actually where the officers will take the product out. They might do temperature control checks, they might do visual checks, they might cook the food up, they might do a whole range of organoleptic tests. So they might take samples for microbiological or chemical analysis. That is all part of the process, but there is a separate video on veterinary checks. The introduction of the border target operating model, the BTOM, has brought in the concept of risk assessment for imports. So if the product you're seeking to import into Great Britain is deemed to be high risk, it will go through 100% of checks. Now, typically that applies to things like live animals. If it's medium risk, then depending on the consequential risk of non-compliance, it will either be subject to something like a 1% check or up to 30% check. So within medium risk, there are several categories, M1, M2, M3, which food is subdivided into. Low risk commodities will not be subject to routine surveillance at the ports. They don't have to go through the full checks, but they might be pulled depending on intelligence that the port might receive. Okay, so that's just an overview of imported food procedures. Much more on our online website, but there are a whole range of other videos available to you on the video channel on each of the topics that I mentioned there. That's just one of 100 videos, so hopefully you'll join me on the next one. Thanks for listening.